The forest was not silent. It only whispered too softly for most to hear. Ellie Reed had learned to listen. Her ears had tuned themselves over the years to the dry creak of pine trunks shifting in the cold, the almost musical drip of melting ice from fir needles, the brittle snap of a fox's paw on crusted snow. Out here, where the roads were more memory than path, silence was never empty. It breathed. She moved with unhurried precision, axe over shoulder, her boots pressing into the snow like a prayer. The early morning had not yet shaken the frost from the branches, and the low sun bled golden light across the glade. Steam drifted from her breath, vanishing as quickly as the past. Ellie stopped beside a fallen tree, half sunk into the frozen ground. With practiced care, she knelt, testing the bark, tracing the grain of the wood as if it were a book in a language only she could read. Then, with 3 swift strikes, she began to cut, not for firewood, for carving. She worked in silence until the echo of something unfamiliar reached her. A soft thud. Not animal, not weather. A sound that didn't belong to the language of the forest. She rose, head tilted. There it was again, a muffled groan, low and broken. Not a wolf, not a bear. Human. She left the axe in the snow and followed the sound, every step deliberate, the kind that had learned not to disturb the woods. She crossed the stream where the ice was thick enough to bear weight, past the old sycamore that leaned like a grieving man. And there, half buried beneath a drift near the base of a jagged slope, she found him. A man. His body was twisted, as if he'd fallen from the rocks above. Snow crusted his hair and lashes, and his coat was torn at the shoulder. His hand twitched, fingers half-clenched. Pale lips moved without sound. Ellie dropped to her knees beside him. His skin was ice. "Hey," she whispered, brushing snow from his cheek. "Can you hear me?" His eyes flickered open, barely. Blue, unfocused. He tried to speak. "I forgot," he mumbled. "Forgot. Winter." Then his head fell back, and he was still. Ellie didn't hesitate. She checked his pulse. It was there, barely. Somehow, impossibly, he was alive. And out here, that was a miracle wrapped in danger. She looked up at the trail he must have fallen from. Steep, unforgiving. No way he'd made it down in any sane condition. And no way help was coming. Not here. Not soon. She leaned close, lifted his head gently, and whispered again, "You're not dying today." It took time, too much time, to drag him across the ice, back to the path, then down to her cabin. Her arms burned, legs ached, breath came in short, sharp clouds. He was heavy, and the sled she used to carry wood wasn't meant for broken men. But she kept moving, one step, then another. The trees watched. The wind didn't help. By the time she reached her door, her fingers were numb. She threw it open, stoked the fire, laid him down on the cot in the corner, covered him in quilts, peeled off his soaked gloves and boots, heated broth, fed it to him in careful spoonfuls. He barely swallowed. All the while, he never opened his eyes again. Ellie sat by the fire that night, watching him breathe in shallow, fragile motions. A stranger fallen from the mountain. A man with a voice like a riddle. She studied his face in the flickering firelight. Not local. That much was certain. No one she'd ever seen in the village or on the trails. His coat was expensive, real wool, lined with something finer than necessity. His boots were city-made. Everything about him said, "I don't belong here." And yet, here he was. Ellie leaned back in the creaking chair, fingers curled around a mug of tea, her thoughts quiet as the snow tapping at the window. A man had fallen from the sky, or something close enough, and the winter had not yet claimed him. Morning arrived slowly, dragging pale light across the wooden floor like a tired traveler. Ellie was already awake, seated at the small table near the stove, sipping weak coffee and glancing every few moments toward the cot. The fire still whispered behind the grate, warming the cabin with its orange breath. Outside, the snow had softened overnight, a gentle weight pressing against the world. The man slept, or something close to it. His breath was thin, but steadier than the night before. The blankets hid most of him, except for a shock of dark hair and a bandaged hand resting against his chest. Ellie watched him as if waiting for the moment when the mountain would reclaim its secret. By mid-morning, his eyes opened. She noticed the flicker before he made a sound. Barely a tremor of lashes, a sudden tension in his fingers. His gaze darted across the ceiling, uncertain, then landed on her. Blue eyes, clearer now. Not clarity born of peace, but of confusion. "Where?" he croaked. "You're safe," she said softly. "In my cabin. I found you near the ridge. You were half frozen." His brows knit. "Cabin?" She nodded. "You fell, or something like it. Do you remember?" He turned his head slowly, as if the motion itself was unfamiliar. "I don't know." Ellie rose and walked to the table near the stove. She poured hot broth into a chipped mug, brought it over, and knelt beside the cot. "Try this. It'll help." He took it with trembling hands, sipped, winced at the heat, but drank again. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated. "I think Jack." "You think?" He blinked, hard. "It's the only thing that feels like it fits." Ellie studied him. He was younger than she'd first thought, early 30s maybe, but carried a weight behind his eyes that didn't belong to youth, a kind of unraveling. "Well, Jack," she said, "I'm Ellie. You're lucky I found you when I did." Jack looked down at his hands, rubbed the bandage on his knuckles as if it might hold answers. "Lucky," he murmured. "That's one word for it." A long silence stretched between them. Ellie didn't mind. She was fluent in silence. After a while, she stood. "You'll need rest. Your leg's bruised, but nothing's broken. You're dehydrated. A few days of food and warmth, and you should be on your feet." Jack nodded, distracted. He stared into the fire like it might unlock something buried in the smoke. "I don't remember the fall," he said suddenly. "I remember walking, a ridge, wind, then nothing, just your voice." Ellie looked at him, startled. "You said something," he continued, "when I was out. Something about not dying." Her voice caught in her throat. She hadn't thought he'd heard her. "I meant it," she said simply. Another silence. This one, heavier. Ellie crossed the room and opened a wooden chest. Inside were folded clothes, coarse but clean. She set a stack near the cot. "You'll find these more comfortable than whatever designer coat you were wearing," she said, her tone almost teasing. He smiled faintly. "Designer?" "The boots, the lining in your coat, city stuff. Too nice for a place like this." He glanced toward the heap of his torn clothes, brow furrowing. "I didn't even notice." "That's the thing about memory," Ellie said, turning back to the stove. "It's polite. It leaves quietly and doesn't tell you why." The rest of the day passed in quiet rhythm. Ellie chopped wood, cleaned fish from the river, stirred a stew that filled the cabin with thyme and steam. Jack dozed and watched and tried, now and then, to remember. But the past was a pane of frosted glass. He could see the light, but not the shapes behind it. That night, as wind curled around the eaves, Ellie brought another blanket and laid it over him. Jack stirred, eyes half open. "Thank you," he murmured. "You're welcome," she whispered, and stood by the fire long after he had fallen asleep. The forest outside was quiet again, but the silence had changed. The days turned white and slow. Jack sat near the window now, wrapped in wool, watching snow fall like forgotten letters from a sky that never wrote back. Ellie moved through the cabin with the ease of someone who belonged, not just to the space, but to the land itself. She carved in silence, each motion precise, her knife parting cedar like it remembered the shape of what she wanted before she did. Jack watched her often. "What are you making now?" he asked one afternoon. She didn't look up. "Fox," he tilted his head. "Why a fox?" "Because it was in the wood," she said simply. Jack smiled faintly, unsure if she was joking or not. "Do you sell them?" "When I need supplies, or when I feel like someone out there needs to remember something they've forgotten." She placed the carved fox on the windowsill beside others. An owl, a small bear, a bird in flight. They watched the world as quietly as she did. "I don't remember liking art," Jack said after a pause. "But when I look at these, it feels like something I used to know." Ellie glanced at him then, her eyes not unkind. "That's how memory works," she said. "It doesn't knock. Just shows up wearing a coat you think you've seen before." He chuckled under his breath. "You always talk like that?" "Like what?" "Like the forest speaks through you." Ellie shrugged. "Maybe it does." They shared a quiet then, not the awkward kind, but the kind that has roots. It stretched between them like a thin thread of warmth. Later, Jack tried to stand for longer than a few minutes. Ellie didn't hover. She let him try, let him wince and lean on the edge of the table, let him learn the rhythm of pain and patience. He was healing, his body faster than his thoughts. "Do you ever get lonely here?" he asked that night, seated at the table while she stirred a pot of stew. "Not really," she said. "Loneliness feels like absence. This place is full." "Of what?" She ladled stew into 2 bowls. "Of things that speak without noise. Wind, trees, fire." Jack picked up his spoon. "Still, no one to talk to?" "I have conversations all the time," she said with a faint smile. "You'd be surprised how much a pine tree knows." Jack took a bite. "Maybe I would." The stew was simple: potatoes, onion, herbs, a little venison. But it filled his chest like something sacred, like home. "Do you remember anything else?" she asked quietly. He paused, the spoon halfway to his mouth. "Flashes," he said. "A hallway with mirrors. Someone playing piano. A storm, maybe. And a voice." "Whose?" He frowned. "A woman's. Not yours. Someone saying my name. Over and over. But it didn't sound kind. It sounded scared. Or angry." Ellie nodded slowly. "Dreams or memories?" "I can't tell the difference." "Does it matter?" Jack looked at her. "Maybe not." She rose to clear the bowls, and he watched her hands. Strong, steady, stained slightly with wood oil and soot. Hands that saved him. Hands that said more than her voice ever did. He wondered who she was before this cabin, what roads she took to get so far from noise, and why it didn't seem to bother her. That night, as the wind rose against the walls and branches scraped at the roof like old ghosts, Jack lay on the cot, listening to the crackle of fire and the quiet rhythm of Ellie's carving. A fox, a bear, a man with no name. He closed his eyes and tried to remember. But what came was not memory. What came was peace. It began with the ticking. Ellie had gone to town for supplies, leaving Jack alone in the cabin for the first time. The silence felt different without her. Not empty, but uncertain, like the room wasn't sure what to make of him without its translator. He moved slowly, testing the strength of his legs, tracing the grain of the floor with each careful step. He paused near the hearth, where her tools lay neatly stacked. Then his eyes landed on a small canvas satchel tucked under the bench by the door. His, or so he assumed. He hadn't opened it since she brought him in. Hadn't wanted to. Now, something in him needed to know. He lowered himself to the floor and unbuckled the flap. Inside, a torn leather wallet, water-damaged and stiff, a handful of bills, a silver pen engraved with an emblem he didn't recognize, and beneath it all, nestled in a wool sock like a secret, a pocket watch. He held it carefully. The surface was scratched, but still gleamed when it caught the firelight. He opened the lid. It ticked. The face was classic. Roman numerals, gold hands, a second dial slowly sweeping. But it was the inscription on the inside of the lid that made his breath hitch. To J.D., time is ours. C. J.D. The letters rang inside him like a bell struck underwater. Familiar. Too familiar. He whispered the initials aloud. The sound was strange in his mouth, like something borrowed. He tried to picture her, whoever C was, the one who had given him this, the one who believed time belonged to them. But the image wouldn't come. That evening, Ellie returned with snow in her hair and cold in her cheeks. She brought coffee, flour, dried berries, and a new pair of wool socks. Jack met her at the door. She raised an eyebrow at the sight of him upright. Someone's ambitious. I needed to move, he said, and I found something. She glanced toward the satchel. Your things? He nodded, held out the watch. Her eyes flicked to the inscription, and she stilled. You think it's your name? She asked. Maybe. J.D. It has to be, right? Could be. He waited for her to say more. She didn't. You're quiet, he said after a moment. I'm always quiet. But this feels different. Ellie walked past him, set down the supplies, and peeled off her coat. That watch, she said, without turning around, doesn't change who you are right now. Just reminds you of someone you were, or someone you're supposed to be. Jack sat back down. The ticking seemed louder now. There was someone else, he said. A woman. I can't see her, but I feel her. She's tied to this watch, to who I was. Ellie met his gaze. Do you want to remember? I don't know. They ate quietly that night, the fire flickering between them like a hesitant candle. Later, as Ellie washed the dishes, Jack sat by the radio, an old wooden thing with crackling speakers. He turned the dial slowly, skipping past weather reports, static, fragments of country songs. Then, a news voice, crisp and clipped. Still no update on the whereabouts of Jack Donovan, CEO of the Donovan Group, who disappeared last month during a reported retreat to his private estate near the Rockies. Authorities continue their search, though poor weather conditions have complicated efforts. Jack turned the dial with shaking hands, silencing the voice. Ellie looked over her shoulder. You heard it. He nodded. You think it's you? I know it is. She dried her hands. Jack Donovan, she said softly. J.D. He didn't speak. The name filled the room like steam. Too hot, too heavy. You're a billionaire, she added. Or were. Jack stared at the pocket watch on the table. That doesn't feel real. Ellie sat across from him. What does? He looked at her. This cabin, this forest. You. They sat in that thin space between truths. The man he might have been, and the man he was becoming. One pressed down by weight, the other rising through snow like light through pine needles. "You're not going to throw me out?" he asked, voice raw. Ellie shook her head. "I didn't bring you in because of who you were." "Then why?" She didn't answer, just looked at him as if that too was a question he would have to answer for himself. Outside, the snow kept falling, and inside, the ticking never stopped. The name settled on him like a coat that didn't fit anymore. Jack Donovan. He whispered it as he chopped wood beneath a heavy sky, each swing of the axe echoing through the trees like a question. He had a name, a title, a story that stretched beyond these mountains. But every time he tried to wear it, it slid off his shoulders. He didn't feel like a billionaire. He didn't even feel like a man from the city. He felt like a stranger in someone else's dream. Inside the cabin, Ellie carved another bird. This one had its wings half open, as if caught between landing and leaving. She said nothing when he came in, only nodded and handed him a mug of coffee. He sat across from her. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, just waiting. "I looked myself up," he said finally. She didn't look up. "I was on a retreat. No one's seen me in weeks. They think I fell. Died. Maybe I did." Ellie smoothed the curve of a wing with sandpaper. "You didn't. But I don't remember anything real. No meetings, no office, just flashes, rooms full of glass and light, a woman's voice, the sound of heels on marble floors. It feels distant, like a movie I watched once." She set down the carving, looked at him fully now. "Then maybe you get to choose." "Choose what?" "Who you are, not who you were told to be." He stared at her, stunned by the simplicity of it. "I don't think it's that easy." "I didn't say it was easy," she said gently. "But it's yours to decide." The idea haunted him the rest of the day. What if the accident wasn't an ending, but a door? What if the man named Jack Donovan had died up there in the snow, and the one who survived this version was something else entirely? That night, as the fire crackled low and the sky outside dissolved into stars, Jack picked up one of Ellie's carvings from the windowsill. A bear, crouched in stillness, muscles carved with reverence. He turned it in his hands. "Why animals?" Ellie didn't answer right away. Then, "Because they know how to be themselves. No pretending, no confusion." He nodded slowly. "That sounds nice." "It is," she said, voice soft. He looked at her, the firelight painting her in bronze. "Why are you out here, Ellie?" "Really?" She hesitated. The logs shifted in the hearth. "I lost someone," she said at last. "Someone I loved. And the noise of everything after. It didn't let me breathe. So I came here, to remember who I was without all that." Jack didn't speak. He couldn't. She looked at him, her eyes clear as thawed ice. "We both came here to forget," she said. "Maybe now it's time to remember who we could be." The fire popped gently, scattering sparks like stars. Outside, the night held its breath, and inside, something began to wake. The days began to blur, like the snow that never quite stopped falling. It fell softly, endlessly, covering everything in its white embrace. But inside the cabin, things were changing, quietly, slowly, as if the warmth of fire and the rhythm of shared silence were knitting something new between them. Jack felt it first in the mornings. When he woke, it wasn't the gnawing emptiness of his forgotten life that troubled him. It wasn't the puzzle pieces of his past that had yet to fit. No, what unsettled him was the strange, unfamiliar feeling of being unanchored, a drifting, weightless sensation like a leaf caught in a gentle current. He sat by the window now every morning, watching the world outside. The same snow, the same trees, the same stillness. but it felt different to him. It had become his world somehow. He turned away from the window one morning to find Ellie standing in the doorway, wrapped in a thick, worn coat, her breath a mist in the cold air. Her eyes met his, calm, steady. "You look lost," she said simply. "I don't know who I am anymore," he replied, his voice carrying a weight he hadn't expected. Ellie stepped inside, closed the door behind her, and placed a basket of mushrooms on the table. She moved with the ease of someone who had spent years understanding the quiet language of the land. "You're still Jack Donovan," she said after a long pause, "but you don't have to be that person anymore." Jack frowned, the name tasting like ash on his tongue. "But I don't know what's left. I don't know what's real. My memories, they're like shadows, like a life I never lived." Ellie unwrapped the mushrooms carefully, setting them down on the counter with a tenderness Jack hadn't noticed before. "It's the roots you're missing," she said softly, looking up at him. "You're not afraid of forgetting. You're afraid of not belonging anywhere." Jack swallowed, the truth of her words settling heavily inside him. It was true. The fear was not of the past slipping away, but of having no place to call home. No roots, no tether. "That's exactly it," he muttered. "I can't remember where I'm supposed to be. I'm just here, with you." Ellie looked at him, then walked toward the fire, stoking the flames with quiet precision. The crackle of the wood seemed to echo her thoughts, sharp and low. She glanced over her shoulder. "There's something beautiful about being here, Jack. About belonging to the silence." She paused, letting her words settle into the space between them. "The forest doesn't ask questions. It just is. And the snow doesn't care who walks in it. It covers everything equally. Makes no distinction." Jack stepped closer to the fire, feeling the heat on his face. "But you belong to it, don't you?" She didn't answer right away. Her fingers lingered on the edge of the grate as if weighing something deep. Finally, she spoke. "I do. Or I did, at least. But that's not the same thing as being lost. The silence speaks louder than any voice, and the wind has a way of teaching you how to listen." Jack felt a stirring within him, a pull, not toward the past, but toward her words, toward the rhythm of her silence. "It's the sound of your voice," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's the only thing I don't want to forget." Ellie didn't react at first. The fire crackled between them, and for a moment, the world outside felt very far away. "You're afraid of forgetting the sound of my voice?" she asked, turning toward him. "Yes," he said, his words carrying the weight of a truth he hadn't known he was ready to speak. "I'm not afraid of losing memories. I'm afraid of losing this, of losing the way you speak, the way you make the silence feel full, not empty. It's the only thing that feels real." Ellie's gaze softened, though she didn't smile. She reached for the carved fox that sat on the windowsill and held it between them. "This," she said quietly, "is all we really have. The moments between the spaces, the breaths, the sound of our voices." Jack reached out slowly, his fingers brushing the edge of the fox's tail. He could almost feel the story in it, the life that Ellie had carved from the wood. The fox, poised between flight and stillness, seemed to hold its own secret. "I'm not asking for answers," he murmured, eyes still on the carving. "Just something to hold on to." Ellie's hand, warm from the fire, rested lightly on his shoulder. She didn't say anything else. But in the quiet that followed, Jack knew that the thing he feared most wasn't forgetting her voice. It was not being allowed to hear it again. It was the noise, that came first. A distant hum, faint at first, like the sound of something far away, something that didn't belong here. Then, like thunder, it grew louder, sharper. A rumbling that shook the cabin and rattled the very air. Jack stood at the window, his heart suddenly in his throat. Outside, the sky had turned a pale, washed-out gray, the kind that made the world feel more empty than it was. And then, breaking through the stillness, a dark shape appeared against the sky. 1, 2, 3 helicopters. Their blades sliced the air like sharp blades cutting through paper. Ellie, who had been working near the fire, didn't seem surprised. She stood still for a moment, watching the choppers approach with an almost detached gaze, as though she had expected them all along. Jack's pulse quickened. The memories, the ones that were still so distant, so fragmented, began to shift like sand. The voices in his head grew louder. "Mr. Donovan, sir. The Donovan Group. The deal." The words pressed against him, filling his chest until he could hardly breathe. "They've found me," he said, voice low. But the certainty in his tone didn't make him feel any less afraid. Ellie turned to him, her expression unreadable. "And?" He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her gaze on him, but unable to speak. This was what he had been running from, wasn't it? The life he had forgotten. The life that had hunted him down. The life he didn't know how to return to. The life that belonged to someone else. Someone who wasn't him. Jack stepped away from the window. "I don't know what to do." Ellie didn't answer. She simply watched him, her face a calm mask, as if she had known this moment would come. As if she had seen it in the quiet sway of the trees, the way they bent with the wind. The helicopters were now close enough to be heard clearly, their heavy blades breaking through the silence of the forest like a storm. Jack's heart raced. He wanted to run, to keep running, but he knew that he couldn't. Not anymore. "They'll want me to go with them," he said, almost to himself. Ellie took a slow, measured step toward him. Her hand brushed his arm gently, a quiet anchor in the chaos of his thoughts. She didn't speak, but her presence was enough. She wasn't pushing him. She wasn't telling him to leave. She was simply there, holding space, letting him find his own answer. The door to the cabin creaked open, and Jack turned to see figures moving through the snow, their forms outlined by the fading light. They were dressed in dark suits, their presence too sharp, too polished for this quiet world. Their voices were strong and commanding, cutting through the air like knives. "Mr. Donovan," one of them called, his tone polite but firm. "We need you to come with us." Jack's breath caught in his throat. The name Donovan sounded foreign now, like a ghost from a life that didn't belong to him. He turned toward Ellie, as if searching for some final clue, some last sign that he wasn't walking away from everything that had begun to feel real. But Ellie didn't speak. She didn't try to stop him. She only stood there, her back straight, her gaze unwavering. For a long moment, Jack didn't move. He was suspended between two worlds, between the man he was becoming and the man he had been. His mind reeled. The helicopters throbbed in the distance, the low hum a constant reminder of the world that was waiting for him. Finally, he stepped toward the door. The figures outside took a step forward, their faces cold, their eyes empty. The man who had called his name stepped into the cabin, extending a hand. "Mr. Donovan," he repeated, his voice as cold and polished as his suit. "We're glad you've recovered." Jack looked at the outstretched hand, his mind suddenly clear. He saw it for what it was, an offer of control, an offer to step back into a life that had never really been his. But that life felt too far away now, too empty. He turned his back on the man and walked toward the door. Ellie stepped aside, not saying a word, as he passed. Outside, the cold air hit him like a slap. But the helicopters loomed overhead, their engines growling like hungry beasts. The men in suits stood in a row, waiting. Jack hesitated at the threshold, looking over his shoulder at Ellie one last time. She didn't say goodbye. She simply closed the door. And in the space between the snowflakes, Jack Donovan, the man who had forgotten who he was, finally walked away from everything he had been. The wind took the rich men, and with them, the name that had never been his. Ellie sat alone by the fire, the soft glow casting shadows that danced on the walls. The sound of the wind outside was a constant hum, a reminder of the world beyond the mountains, a world that felt far away. But inside the cabin, there was only the quiet rhythm of her hands at work. Her carving had taken shape, slow, deliberate. It was a puppet, or at least it looked like one. The wood was smooth under her fingers, the features rough yet tender, as if it were still trying to find itself. She had placed a small, delicate pocket watch in the chest of the puppet, just above the heart. Its gold hands ticked softly, a reminder of time, of life moving forward whether we were ready or not. Ellie stared at the puppet, her thoughts tangled in a web she couldn't untangle. She had always carved with purpose, with a story in mind. But tonight, her hands moved without direction. She was creating something that didn't belong to her, something that was neither Jack nor herself. She stopped. The puppet stared back at her with empty eyes, its little watch ticking louder now, filling the space with a quiet urgency. She placed it on the shelf, beside the others, and turned to the small table where a pile of letters lay. Letters that she had written but never sent. She hadn't known who to send them to. The words were always so heavy, so full of things unsaid. And so, she kept them. She reached for the top one, the paper soft with age, and read the first line again. "I don't know who you are anymore, but I still wish you were here." She set it back down, as if the words had grown too thick in her mouth. Ellie had never been good at letting go, and the letters were the weight of that, unsent, unfinished. She wrote them because the silence, the unspoken things, felt too heavy to carry alone. But with Jack gone, even that felt pointless now. There was a sound, the television. She hadn't meant to turn it on, hadn't meant to listen, but there it was, flickering to life with the buzz of static before the picture sharpened. Jack appeared on the screen. She froze. His face, familiar and foreign all at once, filled the screen. He was standing in front of a tall building, glass and steel, so clean and cold. The camera panned out, showing him surrounded by people, his smile stiff, almost rehearsed. The news anchor's voice echoed through the room, the words cutting through the quiet. And Jack Donovan, after having been reported missing for over a month, is back in the public eye today, making his first appearance since his disappearance. The billionaire CEO returned to the city amidst ongoing speculation about his whereabouts. Sources say Donovan is back at work, focusing on his company's future, though many are wondering if the once celebrated mogul has lost his touch. Ellie turned away, the image burning in her mind. Jack, returning to that world, the one he had left behind, the one that had never fit him. But what was he supposed to do now? What was left for him in the world of polished suits and empty rooms? Her heart ached in a way she hadn't expected. She wanted to reach through the screen and pull him back. But he was gone, drifting again, and she was here, alone with her puppets and unsent letters. The wind howled outside, but inside, Ellie simply stared at the television as the image of Jack Donovan faded into the noise of the world he belonged to. And the winter, though still thick outside, felt somehow colder. The cabin had become quieter as the days passed, the silence now a comfortable companion. Ellie had learned to fill it with the rhythm of her work, the carving of wood, the letters she never sent, the occasional glimpse at the world beyond the snow. But that world had faded into a distant hum, nothing more than a blur of headlines and images that felt like echoes. She had stopped watching the news. The winter was beginning to thaw, the snow becoming a slushy, heavy mess. Spring was hesitant, as if unsure whether to step forward or retreat. Ellie had spent the morning in the woods, gathering firewood, her thoughts lost in the rhythm of her labor. When she returned to the cabin, she didn't expect to find him. But there he was. Jack was sitting on the steps of the cabin, as though he had simply appeared from the earth itself. His clothes were the same as the day he had left: tattered jeans, a dark jacket, scuffed boots, and his face, though weathered, held a quiet familiarity. His eyes, though, were different. They were full of something that hadn't been there before. Something raw, as though he had carried too much weight for too long. Ellie stopped in her tracks, her heart skipping a beat. He didn't speak. He just sat there, his gaze fixed on the ground, as if he were lost in the weight of his own thoughts. She felt an overwhelming surge of emotions, confusion, relief, anger, but above all, something unspoken that caught in her throat. It was Jack, but not the same Jack. He was no longer the man who had once carried the name of a billionaire. He was something else now, something harder to define, something shaped by the very earth he had returned to. She stepped closer, her boots crunching against the dirt. He looked up slowly, meeting her eyes. "I didn't know where else to go," he said, his voice a mixture of exhaustion and something else, something tender, like a long-held secret. Ellie didn't know what to say. She had spent months imagining this moment in 1,000 different ways, but none of them had prepared her for the rawness of his presence. The way the silence between them now felt like a bridge, fragile, yet necessary. You came back," she said quietly. Jack nodded, his eyes lingering on hers with a depth that made her heart ache. "I didn't fit there, not in the world I left behind. It never felt like me, not really. I thought I had to be that person, but I don't know who I am anymore." He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture almost desperate. "I thought I could go back, make it all work. But the moment I walked into that building, I realized it wasn't mine to begin with." Ellie stood there for a moment, letting his words sink in. The world outside was still waking up, the birds beginning to sing their first notes of the day. But inside, everything felt still, waiting. "Then why come back here?" she asked, her voice soft but firm, like the ground beneath their feet. Jack looked down at his hands, his fingers twisted in knots. "Because this place feels real. This is where I remembered who I was, even if I didn't know it at the time, and I couldn't keep pretending anymore." Ellie didn't say anything for a long time. She simply took a step closer to him, her heart a jumble of things she didn't know how to name. Finally, she spoke, her words barely a whisper. "You've come back, but you haven't said goodbye to everything yet." Jack's gaze lifted to hers again, his face drawn but soft, as if he had come to terms with something he had been avoiding. "I know. I'm still trying to figure out what to leave behind." She nodded, her eyes warm but uncertain. They both knew this was no simple return, no easy reconciliation. And yet, there he was, sitting on the steps of the cabin that had once been a refuge. A man who had left the world of names and numbers behind, only to return, still carrying the weight of who he used to be. And now, for the first time, they would have to figure out what it meant to be together, in a world without labels or the ghosts of the past. The days were quieter now. Jack and Ellie spoke little, letting the stillness of the world around them fill the spaces between them. They walked side by side through the woods, the soft crunch of their footsteps blending with the rustle of the trees and the gentle sway of the wind. The snow had melted, leaving behind a fresh layer of earth, wet and fragrant with the scent of new life. Jack's presence beside her was different now, less uncertain, more grounded, as though the weight of his past had been left behind with the snow. They didn't need to talk. The silence between them felt like an old friend, familiar and safe, a quiet language that no longer needed to be explained. Ellie had returned to her carving. The rhythm of her hands moving over the wood, smoothing the edges, felt natural again. She had created a new piece, a sculpture of two birds perched on a single branch. Their wings were outstretched, frozen in mid-flight, and though they were made of wood, there was something about them that seemed alive. She showed it to Jack one afternoon, her hands still stained with the rough marks of the carving. He looked at the piece, his eyes softening as he took in the details. "They're beautiful," he said, his voice quieter than before. But there was something in it now, something more certain. He reached out slowly, his fingers brushing against the bird's wings. "They remind me of freedom," he added, almost to himself. Ellie nodded. She hadn't said it out loud, but she knew what he meant. The birds were meant to be free, suspended in a moment between flight and stillness, just like the two of them, stuck between two worlds, but no longer as lost as before. Jack smiled at her then, a real smile. It wasn't forced or hollow. It was the kind of smile that told her he had remembered something he thought was lost forever. And in that smile, Ellie felt something shift between them. The tension, the uncertainty, the weight of the past, all of it seemed to fade in that quiet moment. There was no need for explanations anymore, no need to talk about what had been or what would come. The moment was enough. They stood there, side by side, looking at the sculpture as the world around them held its breath, waiting for the next chapter to begin. For the first time in a long time, Jack didn't feel like a man who had forgotten who he was. He felt like someone who had finally remembered, and that was enough. Spring arrived quietly, as spring often does, with a gentleness that seemed to breathe life back into the earth. The last traces of snow melted, leaving behind soft patches of green and the hint of new beginnings. The cabin, once a refuge in the cold silence of winter, now felt different, warmer, fuller, as if it had learned to laugh again. By the fire, two pairs of boots sat side by side, worn and comfortable, the leather softened by the seasons. The warmth from the hearth filled the room, a contrast to the cool air still lingering outside. Ellie sat in one of the chairs, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. Jack sat across from her, his gaze quiet. But there was something new in the way he looked at her, something that spoke of peace, of acceptance. They didn't need to fill the space with words anymore. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was filled with a shared understanding, the kind of connection that didn't need to be explained. The old pocket watch that Ellie had placed in the puppet was now resting on a shelf near the window, its golden hands ticking slowly, but without urgency. Time no longer rushed here, no longer demanded anything. It simply existed, as it was, the way time should be. Outside, the trees were beginning to bud, their branches reaching up toward the sky, as though they too were learning how to stretch after a long winter. The birds, real this time, sang from the branches, their songs full of life and promise. Ellie smiled softly, watching the world wake up, knowing that there was no more need to chase what had already come to them. The future wasn't something to worry about. Not now. Not anymore. The past was behind them, and the world ahead was slow, like the thawing snow, gradual, gentle, and full of the possibility that only comes when you stop running. In the warmth of the cabin, with the fire crackling softly in the background, Ellie and Jack sat together, savoring the silence, letting the time stretch between them, unhurried and full of peace. And as the snow melted outside, so did the remnants of the past, leaving only the quiet present, the steady rhythm of life unfolding, one slow breath at a time. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more content. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what you think of the story. Your feedback means a lot.